Welcome to the ninth in the series of our conversations with some of the top leaders in the sector. And today is no different. We have two, can I say, legends, absolute legends of the say. You've both described each other as legends, I think, as opposed to not yourselves, but in the form of Emma Revie and Julie Bentley. Now, for those of you who don't know, Emma is the chief exec of Trussell, the food poverty charity, and I've referenced her a number of times in these previous conversations. And I've also stolen and used your theory of change, that wonderful model with the circle and all the blobs, with lots and lots of clients to help them think about how change can come about, what the prerequisites are, etc. So I owe you a big thanks, but also thank you for joining me today, Emma. It's great to see you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation and to be with the legend that is Julie Bentley.
The legend. There you go. And Julie, the legend, there's Julie Bentley, chief exec of Samaritans, previously chief exec of more than I can possibly list. Fantastic organisations. Julie, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us as well.
It's great to be here, and also it's great seeing some folk coming in. Some of my old gang from some of the former organisations. Lovely to see you.
Seen some of my gang too. It's fun.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to be kind of, I suppose, maybe washing some of our dirty linen, but talking about the challenges that we have and that we have had, I expect, because throughout this series we've been talking about the need for forms of systemic change if we're going to address some of the issues that we face. And we've been honing in really on what is the role that charities need to play in that change, quite often in leading it, because I guess, if we don't, who will? Probably nobody. But that can create tensions. For example, stakeholders or staff who want us to focus all of our efforts on alleviation. That's kind of in their mind what we thought before. So it's understandable when you look at the volume of need. But we also know that in order to reduce that need, to try and get ahead of it, we need to balance the way that we spend our resource, our time, on some of the upstream issues, trying to work towards root causes and that sort of thing. And I know that, so that's the topic of today's conversation, how you manage that as a leader. And I know with Emma, with your organisation, certainly your strategy is absolutely driven around that reduction end of the need for UK food banks. That's right in the centre of your circle. So I guess, would you like to start us off from what does that bring when you put that ultimate end goal at the heart of your strategy, as opposed to alleviation and service?
It makes a huge difference, I would say, to everything that we do. I think we have to be really attentive to making sure that stays the case, because there's so much pressure on food banks, on all of our organisations. You can easily be distracted from it, but within our organisation, it's made a huge difference. And I think how that manifests is if you're always asking yourself the question before you're making any major decision: is this going to further institutionalize the thing that we think is wrong and that shouldn't exist, i.e. giving out food parcels to people who can't afford the essentials? Or is it going to take us further down the road towards a future where people don't need to use food banks? And so whenever we're having major conversations about decisions, changes in directions, new activities we're going to do, that question is front and centre. And just a practical example, really over the last few years since the pandemic, there has been a significant growth in different forms of community food aid, just as different people have seen a need in their community and wanted to respond. And we could have consumed quite a lot of our resource and time thinking about, talking about different models of providing food aid. Is it pantry or larder? Is it social supermarket? Is it food bank? You could go down that route. I think for me, that conversation would have probably been rooted in like making food aid more socially acceptable. Like, what is the best form of it? For us, we were thinking about, well, if this is the thing we don't want to have anymore in any form, in any of those forms, what is a better use of our resource? So I think we've put our energies more into trying to bring those different groups who are experiencing very similar things on the front line, even though their models are quite different, to think about, well, what we do share, the common purpose we do share is none of us think it's right that anyone's having to access our services. So can we put our collective energies into talking about the system change aspects that will make all of our work not necessary anymore? And I think then within our organisation, the effort, the limited amount of effort, energy you have, limited amount of resources you have, we chose to put that instead into, we know if people get access to the right advice at the right time, it can reduce the number of people having to rely on emergency food aid to get by. We can maximise people's income. So instead, over the last 5 years, we've rolled out advice services in over 90% of our food banks. So trying to focus on the activities and putting our energy into the activities that we could see would reduce the number of people having to access our work. So it's how you make your decisions. Is this further embedding us, or is this taking us slowly towards a future where we might not be needed? So it's made a huge difference to us. And we, to the point that we changed our mission statement. Before that, we probably would have described ourselves as a food bank charity that was providing emergency food and support whilst working together to create a future where nobody needed a food bank. But our mission statement now says that we work together to ensure that no one in the UK needs a food bank to survive, whilst providing food and support to people who can't afford the essentials. So front and centre is what we do, and then behind that is the thing we do until such times as we've achieved our goal.
It's amazing how much difference that order of things, in terms of primacy makes. And Julie, you've got, so I should just open question. How does this same challenge manifest for you at Samaritans?
So I think there is slightly different to Trussell. So at Samaritans, our charitable vision, is that fewer people die by suicide. And you'll notice there that it isn't no one will die. It isn't a sort of stark never stop tonality, and that is very deliberate. And that's because well, actually, it probably anchors right back to when we were founded, because when Samaritans was founded, suicide was still a criminal act. And actually, the establishment of a service, therefore, was, in effect, speaking with people who were committing criminal acts, which is why it's very important that when we talk about suicide, we don't use phrases like committed suicide, which suggests a judgment, etc. So for us, it's very complex, suicide. There is no one single factor that leads someone to decides to take their life. So whilst we don't seek to or suggest that we think we should eradicate all suicide, we are very clear that the degree of suicide that we experience across the UK and Ireland, which is the jurisdictions that we're responsible for at Samaritans, is far too high. And in fact, it's going in the wrong direction at the moment. It's going up, not down. And evidence would also tell us that the way to see a very real decline in suicide is not only to support individuals who are struggling in the moment of crisis, but also to address the myriad of factors that contribute to people developing suicidality and suicidal thoughts and feelings, because they are broad, very broad, and there are many of them. For example, having an existing mental health issue, poverty, discrimination, isolation, then add on to that the lack of appropriate and timely support, and the cultural and stigma still attached to suicide. So I would say that a key challenge that we are still facing in Samaritans, and I think we are behind Emma and Trussell in this kind of pivoting, is our ability to effectively and consistently resource the systems change bits of the work that we want to do. Because most of our resource, and just a bit of context for folk that don't know, Samaritans is predominantly delivered by volunteers. We have 23,000 volunteers that deliver the kind of beneficiary focused areas of our work. And then we have a smaller staff team, some of whom are paid in the areas such as influencing policy work, system change, etc. Now, all of our, the bulk of our efforts has historically been towards that listening service, toward being there for the person in crisis. And the honest thing to say about that is we aren't even able to meet that demand. So currently we do not answer all of the calls for help that we get. And so how we then do the systems change piece is both a capacity issue, but it's also an organisational structural issue, because our volunteers delivering the listening service operate across a branch network, a physical network of buildings across the UK and Ireland. What we have is very patchy local and regional influencing. Most of the influencing and systems change work is owned by staff in the central charity and the nation offices. So I think there is a disjoint still, and we're still working out how can we better bring it all together and harness it and get the balance right between, we still need to be here for those people who are in that moment of crisis. Every 90 minutes, someone in the UK or Ireland takes their own life. And we answer a call for help every 10 seconds. And it's a really tough gig, frankly, to try and say, and we must also focus on this systems change, because for many of the people in Samaritans, their focus is very much on, but we've got to be here for that person when they reach out to us in that moment of crisis. Because if we miss the moment, then potentially you're talking about life or death situations. So I would say it's extremely complex, and it's not just really complex for Samaritans, it's complex for many organisations. But we know from everything that we hear from our callers that there are things at a systems level that if they changed, then we would drive out some of those contributory factors. For example, poverty, which obviously links with Emma and Trussell. We know that people living in the most deprived parts of the UK are statistically at a higher risk of suicide. So, you know, it's in our interests to meet our charitable vision that we are doing more to impact that systems change. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, but that tussle between how you decide where the resource and energy goes at any one time is a very real challenge, I would say.
And how it interrelates as well, because I think what you described rings so many bells for me from organisations that I've worked with. That you've got this whole infrastructure of organisation which is focused on delivery, and then you've got this little satellite team that looks after it. You know, whether it's influencing or whether it's, I know within Trussell, or I believe within Trussell, the last time we spoke about this was probably a couple of years ago, but a lot of those, I think, as Julie described it, those factors, those myriad different factors that contribute to these outcomes. And I think you identified 8 or 10 big areas of this, that your teams are not necessarily doing loads of stuff in those areas. They're leaning into existing organisations and existing spaces, bringing people in. Do you, within Trussell, do you have that tension between the bulk of the organisation that's delivering food parcels and these extra bits that are doing influencing or convening or innovation, whatever it is?
I think, yeah, we definitely do. And I think what Julie just said there about that moment, that time, the pressure of having somebody in front of you in that moment, that life-saving work that Samaritans are doing is a pressure we don't have to the same degree. That's a very specific moment in time. Now we do have people coming through our doors who are in crisis, who are requiring support in some of their darkest moments. But I think I was really struck by that difference of time, just having a little bit more time to work with more entrenched issues rather than in a particular moment this person requiring a life-saving intervention. And so I think possibly in some of that space, we've been able to work really hard on kind of trying to entwine the systems change with the operational. And it's slow work and it's never ending work. If you speak to our food banks, we used to talk a lot more about kind of operational and strategic, or operational and systems change work. But for a food bank manager, in the space of like 7 minutes, they could encounter something that's operational, something that's strategic, something that's operational, and actually you can't disaggregate the two in the moment. So I think it's something about how you narrate the two together. And I think going back to what we said at the beginning about kind of our mission statement, our vision statement, and really deeply considering that together as a network and centrally, has helped us. And we're just about to launch our new strategy, but in our previous strategy, we described our work as changing communities, changing policy, and changing minds, these different circles of influence. And it would be quite easy at a cold cut to say, well, the changing communities work is the stuff food banks do, and the changing policy work and the changing minds work is the stuff the central charity does. But we've worked really hard together over the last 5 years to try and have more of a wedge in, wedge out approach to that. So certainly my team at the centre, when they're engaging with supermarkets about collection points, and when they're trying to source additional food or looking at crates for holding stuff, feel part of providing an emergency food parcel. They feel that their work is contributing to that very cutting edge frontline activity. But obviously a large part of that work is taking place. The majority of that work is taking place in food banks. But similarly, in the past, our food banks might have articulated policy work as something that Trussell did at the centre on their behalf. Whereas now we have local organisers in food banks working with people who are accessing our services to change policy locally. But also there's the volunteer who's collecting the data on who has access to food bank in a given day and capturing the reason why somebody has come, knows that that piece of information is going to be presented to seats of highest power in the country, and that is them carrying out an act of solidarity and an act of justice in their food bank in that moment, capturing that piece of information. And so we've done a lot of work tying how our strategy globally plays out in your food bank in the East End of London with your community there. How are you changing policy there? How are you seeking to change minds there? How are you changing communities? And I think being able to narrate all of your work through that lens of strategy. So, for example, it could be more efficient to give people tickets and post parcels to people's houses. You could find a more efficient way of dealing with this significant increase in the number of people coming to food banks. But that wouldn't be seeking to end the need for food banks, because you wouldn't have had space for a conversation or a cup of tea or a place of breathing and a space in which you could provide advice or signposting to services that would help alleviate the underlying driver of why somebody is coming to a food bank. And I think, therefore, what might feel like an operational decision not to provide ticketing or ship parcels out in a straightforward, efficient way is actually a very strategic operational decision, that we're going to create a space that's like a cafe and invite you in, and that focus on that warm welcome and a cup of tea, because that cup of tea is not only compassionate, it's not only a vital upholding of somebody's dignity, but it is a strategic imperative if you are going to bring the right advice to people who need it at the right time. And so I think being able to frame all of our activities and link all of our activities back, often through quite complex theory of change, but to do that thinking, that deep thinking about how the operational actually deeply informs and drives the systemic change, but also how the systemic change is enacted through those individual interactions of volunteers and staff members in food banks, it is a constant piece of work that as leaders we're having to be attentive to, because otherwise that disconnect just widens and you feel to your front line, I think, like you're not hearing or understanding. And I think it's a real danger for us always. So you're kind of constantly vigilant to it and trying to be out there in the front line understanding what's going on.
And if I could just build on that, I think in Samaritans, there has been a shift, I think, in attitude around some of this systems work over the last 5 years. When I joined, which is coming up for 5 years ago now, and was going out to the movement, meeting volunteers, talking to them, there was, I would think it would be fair to say, I encountered quite a lot of cynicism about policy and influencing. And what is that? And we shouldn't be doing that. And that's not what Samaritans is about. We're here for people in crisis. And I've definitely seen a real shift in that. And that now, you know, when I'm at branches and I am able to, I often get asked now by volunteers, the data that we collect when we're talking to callers, what happens to that? And when I say, well, you know, we look for themes and trends that we can then take to our meetings with government, to decision makers, we can hold a mirror up and say, look, you know, we've seen a marked increase, for example, in callers who are talking about very, very real concerns about financial hardship as a result of what's going on with, you know, benefits cuts, etc. You know, that we can absolutely use that really rich information that we get every day from thousands of callers to see pictures and trends, but also to tell stories around, you know, the real complexity of suicide and suicidal feelings. And so I think in Samaritans, we've seen the shift in our volunteer base around kind of seeing the value of that. But I think probably the area we continue to struggle in is how to, and I'm going to try and say a word that if you ask my team, they know I can't say. So I'm going to operationalize. If we look to how we do that, because all of the branches across Samaritans are entirely delivered by volunteers, they're all there first and foremost because they're trained as listeners to be there on the service, almost entirely that, with some support volunteers doing some of the kind of, you know, supporting the branch function. So at the moment, Samaritans present locally in influencing is very sporadic and completely uncoordinated. And so we have in some branches, generally the bigger branches that have got more volunteers who have the time and space to think about, actually, there's a local suicide prevention group, we should be on that and we should be helping to influence work on that locally. Generally, it happens now if the people in leadership roles in branches have the knowledge and the insight and the skill, and they have enough volunteers to be able to deploy some of their volunteer resource to that. And there isn't, or hasn't historically been, a kind of central coordination of these are the things that Samaritans seeks to be influencing on, you know, or support for that. Now, this year, or maybe last year, we've been trying to think about how can we resource it. So using the model that we have, which is we have a lot of people in leadership roles in Samaritans that are volunteer roles. We recruited 2 senior lead volunteers for policy and influencing that are working with the paid staff team. And their first piece of work, if you like, was to kind of understand the landscape and what might branches need to better engage in this local policy and influencing work. But it's a slow burn, and the challenges are, you know, very real in terms of capacity. But also, and again, I think we might move on to think about this bit in a minute, there are very different perspectives in Samaritans about what we should and shouldn't be saying on subjects. So whilst we might take, you know, a policy position that is supported by a great many people across the movement, there will also be people who say, why we shouldn't be expressing a view on that. You know, why are we talking to government about that? And actually, when you're trying to do that across the movement of the size and scale of Samaritans, it can, you know, that can be a challenge in itself. But I definitely think the temperature has shifted in the last 5 years internally around understanding the imperative and the value of not only being there in the moment of crisis for individuals, but also actually seeking to play our part. And that's important because, you know, actually we have a little part to play alongside many other people. Play our part in making sure that we're thinking about that wider systems change.
There's a few things that I just want to pull out of that because that's really, really interesting to hear. And I would echo your experience with the Samaritans, Julie. I've seen that to an extent in other organisations to different degrees at different pace, but this sense that actually these non-core delivery things are actually a lot more important, potentially influential longer term than we might have given them credence for. And the one thing that stands out, 5 years ago, I would ask organizations, you know, why do you deliver all of these services if your aim is to change the world? And it would be, well, because that way we've got scale and we can then command a seat at the table and we can have these conversations with politicians. And that shifted to this kind of things that you talked about, which is because we're gathering all this data, because we're really understanding this stuff, we can then present them with insights. And I think that's that idea of data pulling into the center, I think it's probably more complex for you both than it is for most organizations, just because of the way you're structured. And I'm going to ask a question about that in a second. But for me, what I'm seeing now is this start the understanding that, if we get all the insights into the center from all of the activities that we do to use that and influence, there's also then a channel that comes back the other way, which is around education, possibly skills and development, so that we can start to do these activities at a local level. But I think that all of that's harder. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's all of that's harder for you because of the scale of your volunteering operation and the fact that you're both running sort of networks like, federated organizations, that you don't have that. You only have a limited share of these people's mind. It's not like they're employees or anything. So I don't know whether that makes it as hard for you as I think it must be. What are your thoughts?
I
Go ahead, Emma,
no, no.
start.
I was I was going to say it's our superpower and also our biggest challenge. So we've got 40,000 volunteers across our network, and these are people who, like during the pandemic, when we were all stepping indoors and closing the door, they stepped out. They're people who, on average, are volunteering like 15 hours a month. They're just extraordinary people who give and give and give and give, and I am constantly in awe of them. But if you are invested to that degree, you are invested to that degree, and therefore this is Trussell. Your food bank is your food bank. This is, for some of them, they set their food bank up 15 years ago and have been tirelessly working at it ever since. And quite rightly, it's their organization. And so that's 40,000 different people's view of what that organization is and how it delivers. And we describe ourselves essentially at Trussell as in service of our network, because our entire legitimacy comes from the work of our volunteers and staff in food banks. There is no Trussell without those people who locally set up their food banks and are doing that work day in, day out. But it's not as easy as calling like a team meeting and getting your gang in one room and having a chat. So you've got a lot of passion, the superpower, a whole range of people in 1,400 different communities facing slightly different issues, all unique, but all hugely invested in what you do collectively. And so it creates some different leadership challenges from ones that I might have encountered in organizations that were more centralized. There's so many pros to it in that you are rooted in local communities, like literally rooted in every community. And so you hear so much more about what's going on. You see the diversity of challenges that people are facing, and therefore you can represent those issues more deeply and in a more textured way to people who have the power to do something about those situations. But then if you're going to do your job well, you need to be informed and represent and understand more deeply all of those different issues. But also you need to create spaces in which people feel that they can steer the activity of what's going on at the centre. And that takes time, and it's highly relational work. And so I talk often about Julie Bentley, because she is like the absolute model of this type of leadership. If you are friends like I am with Julie Bentley on Facebook, you get to see her journeys around the UK. And she's always off with her wee bag to some travel lodge / Premier Inn, meeting local groups who are running Samaritans. And I like follow in the footsteps of Julie Bentley with my bag, a lot of times on a train, in a car, sometimes on a plane, going out, because that's how you honour the commitment of volunteers and staff who are turning up every day. You travel to them, you spend time with them, you hear from them, and you have to create spaces in which you are co-producing your plans and your strategies, because it's not Trussell's strategy. And the minute it becomes just Trussell's strategy at the centre, it's not worth the paper it's written on, because we're not the ones going to be implementing it in local communities. So we're I know we've talked about this before, Julie. Like when you come into a new organisation as a chief exec, sometimes there's an expectation that you like roll out a strategy quickly, like put your mark on it. I remember when I came into Trussell, I think it was over 18 months later that we had our first strategy in place because it took 18 months to actually build a structure where you could be co-producing that with food banks, where they were looking at the external analysis, looking at the data internally, collating all of the challenges they were seeing, coming up with the plans and doing that work together. So you have to be quite, obviously you can't go to all 1,400 food bank centres every week for a team meeting. So you have to have systems and structures in place. So for highly relational work, you have to put all of yourself into it, but you also have to have great systems and structures whereby you're getting the insight and the intelligence, but also feeding back. These are your words being played back to you in this strategy document. These are your examples and the challenges you've outlined. So every food bank who's opening up the central strategy says, I can see myself, my place, my challenges, my opportunities reflected in that document. And it's a continuous process, not just making the document in the first place, but then what does it look like as you review it at the end of year one, as you think again about what that means for year two. So it's a constant cycle of engagement. And as I say, it's the greatest privilege of my role to get to hang out with our food banks and engage with these extraordinary people. But it's an activity that never ends.
Following in the footsteps of the legend that is
Julie Bentley.
Julie Bentley. Then there is I get what you do, even in sort of more normal organisations, is that I call it the sort of dance of strategy and culture as people start to evolve. What's they're thinking. Julie described it as that people are now shifting towards this, and that allows you then to create a strategy that then takes the next steps in that space. But Julie, as the legend in this sort of relational leadership piece, how do you manage?
Can we just all stop using that word?
No, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's not rocket science that if you are the CEO of an organization that is federated or highly dispersed and has a high propensity of volunteer workforce, that you can't really lead that organization if you don't spend time with those people. I'm not sure that is rocket science. So but I think one of the things that, just to build rather than repeat, because you could just say repeat everything Emma just said and it would be relevant for Samaritans and indeed probably relevant for every other federation, and having been the chief exec of Girl Guiding as well some years ago, it's still similar. I think there's one of the challenges is, and one of the killer questions is, who knows best what's right for this organization and for our service users? And there can be a risk in federations and in organizations that have a high propensity of volunteers that there's such silo working that everybody's truth about what this organization is focused on what the bit they know. So I always joke whenever I go to a Samaritans branch, literally without exception, I kid you not, every Samaritans branch I've ever visited, and I've been to nearly 80% of them so far now, they all at some point tell me, of course you do know that we're the best Samaritans branch, don't you? And I always say, of course you are. And that's what all of the other 75% have said to me when I've been to see them as well. But I've had many conversations over my time in both Girl Guiding actually and in Samaritans as two federations, that when I've been talking to volunteers about change that might be needed, I've been told, well, you clearly don't understand this organization, you don't understand Samaritans. And I say, tell me what I'm not understanding, and they'll tell me how it is. And very often what they tell me is how it is in their bit of Samaritans, their branch. And that's another reason why it's so important to spend time out across the federation, because at times what I have to say is, I understand that's your experience of being part of this branch, but actually I've been to 75% of all of our branches, and that's not their reality. That's not what happens in that branch. So I understand it's your experience, but actually it's a much wider experience across the whole of the Samaritans movement. And because, we have many folk who haven't been to other Samaritans branches, so their experience is very rooted in their local experience. And I think one of the other challenges of leadership of these types of organizations is, I don't know if you ever get this, Emma, but I often hear the word corporate. We don't like the corporate central charity. And often that word arises when we talk about things like strategy, or when I talk about things like service capacity, how we meet service capacity. That's very corporate. We have to do that in our day job. We don't want to do that here. And actually, you then have to remind folk, I understand that you're volunteers and that you're here for much deeper reasons than in a paid role. But actually, Samaritans is a core public service that we deliver. And we have to talk about things like service capacity. We have to talk about the fact that at the moment, we are failing to answer up to 30% of our calls because we don't have the right capacity, and we aren't coordinating our capacity well enough across our movement. We have a duty to our service users to be talking about these things. And I can't help it if that feels corporate, because that is my responsibility to make sure that we're addressing those issues. And having those conversations with volunteers, I think, is more difficult than with paid staff. But nonetheless, we have to have those conversations. And I think we're currently in a period of really doing some serious thinking about the future and what the challenges that Samaritans face are, and what we need to do to make sure that Samaritans is fit for the future. When I say the future, I'm meaning, 10, 15, 20 years out from now. Because we share some similar challenges with other organisations, and then we have some that are particularly pertinent to volunteer delivered organisations around the changing nature of volunteering and capacity, etc. Like Trussell, we have relied on the most extraordinary degree of commitment from volunteers. People who literally have given 40 and 50 years of service to Samaritans, almost like, full-time paid jobs, but in volunteer roles. It's extraordinary what people have given to Samaritans. But what we know is that volunteers of the future are not going to give their time in that way. And therefore we've got to adapt. Otherwise, Samaritans will be at risk for the future. And one of the ways that I'm trying to talk about that is, I said recently on a call with like 400 of our volunteer leaders, we all are, whether we're paid or volunteer, we are guardians of this charity for a period of time. And as guardians of the charity, we have to be concerned about the here and now. But it is also part of our job to think about, how do we safeguard this organisation for the future if we believe the service is still going to be needed? And sadly, looking at the way things are in relation to mental health, I think we do know that Samaritans is going to be needed into the future for a period of time. So it's about, for me, it's a constant kind of balancing of recognizing that without our volunteers, we wouldn't be able to deliver the Samaritan service, and that they were a crucial component, but also never losing sight that the most important thing in Samaritans is indeed the service users and the beneficiaries, and constantly trying to anchor us back to, why are we here? We're here so that fewer people die by suicide. Ultimately, that is why we are here. And all of our decision making, even if it means we have to think about things through a corporate lens, has to be focused on those service users. I'll share a story with you. When I went for my interview for the job of Chief Exec Action for Children, which had a couple of thousand volunteers and 6,000 paid staff, and I was challenged in the interview with the question, you don't really have the experience to deliver an organisation of the scale of Action for Children, do you? Because, Girl Guiding has only got 300 staff. And I said, well, actually, you're wrong there. Girl Guiding has 109,000 staff plus 300 paid. And trust me, it's far more complicated trying to lead an organisation with a workforce of that scale that are not paid than it will be to try and lead a workforce of 6,000 paid people. And I think that that is massively underestimated often in volunteer delivered organisations. The leadership challenges is far, far more complex and needs a much, much higher degree of what I would call the soft skills, and being willing to just be very, very humble and authentic, through some what can be some really challenging conversations.
I would argue that those same skills, when you're going into this sort of systems change space, because it's so collaborative and because it's so dependent on lots of others, that it is those same skills that kind of come to the fore.
Yeah,
And I don't know if we're going to get as much chance to talk about the future of volunteering today. And it feels like a massive topic because, you're right, there's people like yourself, Citizens Advice, St. John's, that, that are all very dependent on very deeply committed and deeply skilled um, volunteers. But one of the things that you talked about before is we were talking about, the relational leadership in terms of engaging people with that need to think upstream as well as delivering. Challenge of that was, I think that you both sort of touched on it, this emotional attachment that people get to their image and their experience of the organization, that representation that they have of what the organization is for. And it made me think of, obviously there are other stakeholder groups, there are your donors, and I don't know if this is a myth. This is, just on the Daily Mail thing. But the idea that, you should be sticking to your knitting, that you should be, doing all that frontline stuff and not playing politics and not getting involved in these things. Is that something that you face with your donors and your main supporters and those other stakeholder groups, or is that blown out of proportion? What's your experience of having those conversations about this sort of shift in focus?
I would say we've done a lot of work to avoid that, but it definitely comes up on occasion. And I think it's being really clear, having a clear answer to that challenge. I think for us, our food banks, our volunteers would articulate really clearly this daily sense of the insufficiency of a food parcel to meet the needs that are presenting in front of them when people are coming through our doors. An emergency food parcel doesn't pay your electricity bill, doesn't cover the costs of travel to work, doesn't pay for school trips or school shoes. It's a food parcel and it can do one very specific thing. But when it's so clear and so evident, just even a few minutes into a conversation with somebody, that the issue is so much wider, then it's not about access to food, it's about not being able to afford essentials, one of which is food. So when you're really clear, I think with all of your stakeholder groups, supporters, donors, volunteers, wider partners, that what you are seeing is not a lack of access to food, but a lack of affordability, lack of income to cover the cost of essentials, then you reframe that conversation. We then can present data like where we have provided advice services and been able to secure financial gains for somebody, 25% of those people don't come back to a food bank again. So materially, there is something we can do, a service we can provide that's not about gathering tins and not about providing food to somebody, that materially means somebody is not coming back again to a food bank, not finding themselves in that same situation again. Therefore, that's not an add-on to our core work. That is our core work. So you're demonstrating the possibility of transformation. I think you just have to take the time to tell those stories, to explain the interconnectedness, that through work, for example, that we did around cost of living increases during the early stages of the cost of living crisis, where the government made the decision to apply cost of living payments to people. In the 3 weeks after those cost of living payments arrived into people's bank accounts, food bank numbers dropped by 30% for 3 weeks. So hence proving our case that if people had enough money, they don't come to food banks, and therefore we need to ensure people have enough money. And I think you have to tell those stories, and you have to tell those stories in a way that different audiences can hear and access. Because the thing that unites both our donors and our volunteers and anyone, any of our partners, the one thing that unites people is they don't want to see somebody going hungry. So you start there and you work out to explain the interconnectedness. And it's kind of like the reverse of your theory of change. You have to say, if you just go straight in and say we're providing advice services or we're involved in policy and campaigning, and people are at the point of thinking, well, I want somebody not to be hungry, then you're losing them. You have to link it back. Why are people hungry? They're hungry because they don't have enough money to afford food. Where does that money come from? Some of it's coming from our social security system. What's changed in our social security system? Are there things that have changed there that have caused those numbers to go up and down? Yes, here's the evidence for that. Therefore, if we're involved here, we're going to see less people here. And for our volunteers, there's such hope in that. It's the fuel that drives them. You can, and people do feel overwhelmed when they're hearing story after story, providing parcel after parcel. But knowing that part of the way in which they are working is also seeking to bring that systems change, that would mean there will be a point in the future when people aren't having to come and make impossible decisions and come for a food parcel because they've had a particularly big gas bill that month. That there's a point in the future where that won't happen because of the work that they're doing and the way in which they are doing that work. Then people come together. You start at the point where they are and you link it back to the activities that you're doing. And then people are all in. So I think our donors are extraordinary in that they've come on that journey with us and stay on that journey with us, even though it's a long-term journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's absolutely right. And that resonates enormously in terms of Samaritans. I mean, if we think about what we want is a future where it is a rare occurrence that somebody feels so hopeless, so stuck, and so unable to see tomorrow that they choose to take their own life. It's storytelling that helps to describe and explain why we do the different things that we do and why some of the things that might not seem obvious that we spend time and resource on. So, for example, for Samaritans, if we were to talk about, we do a lot of work around online environments. Well, we do that because we know that one of the biggest factors that could really significantly have an impact on suicides is what we call access to means, as in access to the means to take your own life. And we know that the online environment has been a bit out of control in relation to that. So we prioritize doing work in that area because we know if we can drive out some of that access to means information, that has a very direct link to suicide rates. And then equally, the work that we do around media, which might seem, really like, where's that coming from? We do a lot of work around media guidelines and advising the media in how to report on and talk about suicide, whether it be literally reporting things in the news or whether it be an EastEnders storyline about a suicidal character. And we know that is crucial because we know that if suicide is reported in the wrong way or represented in a drama or TV program in the wrong way, that it can lead to what we call contagion, which is it can actually lead to other people doing what they've read about or watched on the TV. So we know that the media work that we do, again, has a direct correlation, direct link to our vision of wanting there to be fewer people dying by suicide. And as Emma said, those things aren't necessarily obvious, but once you actually tell that story and explain that, then, and you can show the link between that activity and your charitable vision and your beneficiaries, the people you're there for, then actually it does change people's attitude and perception.
And by the sounds of it, it also reinforces that need within your organisation for information to flow, because it's those spikes that you're seeing, it's those relationships that you're able to draw out and then present. I was going to ask you both about how do you span with your narrative across that, very front-facing, give us some money for a food parcel versus the influence. But you've answered that question beautifully, both of you, is about creating that narrative, as you said, Emma, almost sort of working backwards through your theory of change in order to illustrate it. So instead of that, just mindful of, in our last 7 or 8 minutes together, this is probably might be a little bit of an unfair question. It's quite a challenging question. It's just I'm aware that with both of your organisations, and we've talked about this, that the food poverty is increasing, so the number of parcels that you're giving is increasing. You talked about it also, Julie, in terms of the level of the numbers of people taking their own lives, and the 30% beyond your capacity to deal with the calls that are coming in. When you've pinned your colours to the mast of reduction, in a sense, how do you organizationally, how do you cope psychologically with the fact that some of these indicators are and have been for several years going in the wrong direction? What does that do for morale, for engagement, for trust? How do you manage that as a leader? That must be tricky.
I think it is very tricky. And I think, when you work, when you work in a suicide prevention organization and you see suicide rates are going up, yeah, that's pretty demoralizing. But you just have to step back and you have to look at the bigger picture, and you have to make sure that you are both understanding and communicating what's happening here, what's the environment. We know that many folks, particularly younger people, are facing a very different kind of challenge to the challenges that we may have faced 10, 20 years ago. And it can feel a bit relentless. But for me, anyway, I just do that, bringing it back again and re-anchoring myself around, well, we are here because we want there to be fewer deaths by suicide, and we are here for service users. So we just need to redouble our efforts and better understand what can we do in our little bit of this world, or in the, as I refer to it, the mental health ecosystem. What can we do? And part of that is not trying to do everything and not trying to be everything to all people, and working much better in partnership and collaboration with others, because poverty, as Trussell deals with, and suicidality, and mental ill health, they are not issues that any one organization is going to solve on their own. It needs a real coming together of the sector and understanding our different places within that, and then leaning into the bits that are our bits, but actually just standing back and trusting others to do the bits. And I think one of the things that we do struggle with in the sector, certainly we struggle with in Samaritans, is thinking we've got to do everything, and we've got to try and be all things to all people, and we find it really hard to stop doing stuff. But we need to, because the challenge, frankly, that we're facing in our society is too huge. It just really is.
Everything Julie just said. I think the most common conversation I probably have with food bank leaders and volunteers is that they need to set aside the expectation that they can support everyone who's experiencing hunger and hardship, and that they can solve all of the issues that they're being confronted with. There's 9.3 million people in our country facing hunger and hardship today. If we doubled the resource in each of our food banks, if we trebled the resource in each of our food banks, we wouldn't be meeting the needs of every single one of those people. And that's why I think systems change work is so core to the heart of everyone who's involved in our work. Because you can say, however, how you have done your job today is contributing to the change that is possible, that can, in our case, people experiencing that level of poverty that they are having to access an emergency food parcel, that actually can be changed. We can be in a situation where people aren't having to come to food banks. We can tackle that deep poverty and food insecurity and bring people to a level where they're held above a line where they're having to rely on a food bank to get by. And being able to show those examples of where the change is happening. I talked about 25% of people who achieve financial gains with us don't come back to a food bank again. We can see where people's incomes have gone up, where we've been able to secure that with them, or their circumstances have changed. They're not coming to food banks. Letting our staff know that every single thing that they're doing, every volunteer activity is contributing towards that change that will ultimately see a future where nobody has to come to a food bank, because none of us are allowing that to happen, I think renews that hope. But I think once you've held that context, once you've reminded our incredible volunteers and staff of that context, then I think saying to them, however, that person that you met today, who you met with a warm welcome and a cup of tea, who you supported to access food, and who you signposted to extra support, their circumstances are better because they encountered you. And if you had not been there, and they had not been able to encounter you, they would be in a much more difficult situation than they are now. And that is what you're adding. It's not, you could have a deficit mindset to it, that there are so many people we're not supporting. There are so many more people who are needing to access our support. But these volunteers and our staff, like, you need an asset-based approach. It's not a problem we can fix on our own. It's not a problem that we have it in our gift to fix on our own. There are policy changes, there are systems changes that are needed. But today, the people you encountered are in a better place because they encountered you. And that is worthy of doing.
What a fabulous positive note to almost finish on. I am going to ask you both one more very, very brief question, sort of, one sentence answer in a second. But what I love about, the conversation that we've just had is we talked about a huge amount of challenges, and I get so much feedback from other leaders who, I'll refrain from using the L word, but who, when they hear other esteemed people who they esteem, who are leaders, actually talking about the challenges and how tricky this stuff is to balance, because it gives them it's not just me then feeling. It's very easy to see other people as the swan from the outside, isn't it? But to finish on such a positive note, that's wonderful. The one question that I was going to ask, just very brief, in a line, if you like, is, what would you share then from other stuff that we've talked about, or from your own journey? What would you share as the kind of the nugget of advice for other leaders who are in similar situations to you, trying to find this balance and navigate these relationships? What little gem would you parcel up for them for us to close?
I think I would say be quite ruthless in focus. What's your job? Not you, the person. What's your organisation's job? So be really focused. Don't try and be everything to all people. Think first about, how could I do this in collaboration, or who could do it better than we could? And above and beyond everything else, in every consideration you have a laser focus on your charity's vision and your beneficiary group.
Emma?
I would agree with
It's a high bar to beat, that one, isn't
Julie's
it?
wise words. The phrases in my mind often is mission before ego. Like, we're not in these jobs to prop up institutions or keep our companies going or make a profit. We're in it to create change. And that's not something you can do on your own. And so how do you lay aside your organizational ego, your personal ego, all of that, to get in about it? Because, as Julie says, a laser focus on the people we're here to serve and the mission we've stated together we're seeking to achieve means we need to be looking outside, looking to collaborate, looking to set ourselves to one side in order to do what is best in achieving that mission. So yeah, often I have to remind myself, mission before ego.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And that's a really good segue towards our next session. So for those of you who are interested, on 17th of July, our final session before the summer, we've got Matt Downey from Shelter and Lindsay McDonald from Magic Breakfast. Both of those organisations have, in a way, kind of almost pledged to put themselves out of business. So taking what Emma just said to the extreme about putting mission before ego, before the institution, that we run. So if you're interested in that, when I send out the video recording, there will be a link that you can register for that as well. I would love you to join us. But just for now, Emma, Julie, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts and all of your experience. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Having us.
Lovely to see some friendly faces.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.